Welcome and thank you for attending the Agriculture 1 session at the 2016 CSAE Conference on Economic Development in Africa. I am Hanane Ahmed and will be your session chair. I'm excited to learn more about the diverse and interesting set of topics on agriculture that will be covered in this session. And the overarching theme in this session is land rights in their various forms. And each paper looks at the impact of these rights on various outcomes, including agriculture risk management, agriculture productivity, women's empowerment, and tenure security. But what makes this session more interesting is the way the topics of the papers are tied together. That is, agriculture risk management is important to understand because of its direct linkages with agriculture productivity, which not only have implications for all farmers, but particularly female farmers who tend to be more susceptible to economic vulnerability. And these various papers will be discussed by presenters from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and the World Bank. Given that we have a very limited time for 4 presentations, followed by discussions, I would like to give a friendly reminder about the House rule on time management. For those presenting, you only have 15 minutes to do so. This yellow card is your first warning that you have 5 minutes left, and the red card is your second warning that you have 2 minutes left. To the discussants, you have only 4 minutes, and you will see the 2 minutes yellow card warning. A guideline for discussants to follow is, please do not summarize the paper, select 2 or maximum 3 points in order to start the discussion. After the 4 minutes of discussion by the discussants, there will be 10 minutes discussion per paper with the audience. And now we move to the first presentation by Matthias Kalkuhl from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. The topic is agricultural risk management and climate change. This is a co-authored paper with Gregor Schwerhoff and Katarina Waha. I hope I correctly pronounced the names.
I think I will use this one here. So thank you very much for this kind introduction. I hope I can stay in time with the 15 minutes because I prepared for 20, but it should be possible anyway. So it's an honor for me to open the first parallel session here in this annual conference with a paper which focuses on land tenure, in particular sharecropping and risk management. So what is sharecropping? Sharecropping means that the farmer does not own the plot, but rather is allowed to cultivate the land and gives a certain part of the harvest to the landlord. Usually this is 50% of the harvest, but there are different arrangements possible. The literature so far focused on 2 effects of this sharecropping tenure type, and one is the effort effect, which means that farmers who give a certain amount of their harvest away to the landowner are effectively taxed, and this reduces their effort and the incentive to use fertilizers, for example, and to increase the production. There's empirical evidence for this, and this has been long described and taken up by the literature. There's a second issue which is related to tenure security, because sharecropping farmers do not own the land, they do not know whether they can cultivate the same plot also in the future, and this reduces incentives to invest into long-term productive measures to conserve soil quality. So land degradation is an issue here, and we have other talks in this session which focus on this. So there has also been a lot of research into this area which explains this tenure security problem with sharecropping. In my presentation, I will focus on the risk aspect of sharecropping, and this is related to weather risk as a major form of risk in the agricultural sector. We do not look into price volatility and price risk, which is also important factor and might affect productivity in the agricultural sector. Rather, we look into rainfall risk as a major form of production risk in rain-fed agriculture. This is related to climate change, of course. We are very unsure how precipitation patterns will evolve in the future. However, there are certain indications that weather becomes more extreme, more volatile, difficult to predict, There is evidence in India for this, and it's probably also happening in Africa as well. So we look into 3 types of risk management strategies. One is sharecropping, and I will explain why this is a form of risk management strategy. Then livestock use as a traditional form of risk management, and reduction of fertilizer use, which is reduced intensification, which also reduces risk, however, which has some costs and reduced yields. I will present a very small analytical model to explain the major intuition and the major dynamics which we would expect from this, and then I will focus on the empirical research, where we used a large household data set from 9 African countries, and we merged this with climate data, and the basic findings, just to take it already here, the major conclusion: sharecropping is indeed a risk management strategy. It's linked to climate factors, although we often think about African land markets as very rigid and determined by traditional and cultural laws. We find evidence that indeed these traditional land tenure types are rooted in underlying climate factors. And finally, land tenure types and sharecropping are linked to other risk management strategies like livestock use and intensification choice. So let me explain briefly the analytical model. So we consider 2 types of farmers. One is a renting farmer and one is a sharecropping farmer. And both maximize their revenue, which depends on the harvest here. It's also already expressed in monetary terms. And the renter, of course, has to pay rent for the plot. And the renter can increase the harvest by applying fertilizer, F, and there are costs associated to the fertilizer choice. The important thing is here that the rent and the fertilizer use are certain. The costs that are attached to these 2 are certain, while the benefits here depend on the harvest size, and the harvest is uncertain. So we have uncertainty here. For the sharecropper, the picture looks a bit similar. So he can also decide on the fertilizer use, but a certain share of the harvest goes away to the landlord. So it reduces the amount of revenue, and there is no rent paid because all the rent is in the share of the harvest. So we consider 2 cases in our empirical model. One is the fertilizer use, which can increase the harvest but also increases the uncertainty. But we also consider livestock use, and livestock use can be simply incorporated in this model as negative F, which reduces the amount of harvest, for example, because land is devoted to livestock or labor is devoted to livestock, and on the other hand, you have a certain benefit or a certain revenue from having livestock, which is not related to uncertainty. So the farmers maximize expected utility. We use just a standard utility function, which is tractable, which brings us to the expected utility framework, where we can calculate the certainty equivalent of the profits as the mean profits minus eta half of the variance of the profits, and eta is the absolute risk aversion parameter. Then we look into 2 aspects. One is, how do farmers choose their optimal input choice, and how is this related to risk and to land tenure type? And second, would farmers prefer to be a renter, or would they rather prefer to be a sharecropper? And in the paper we develop a bit the theory about this, but what comes out here is that the renter, the fertilizer decision of the renter is given by this equation, and this means that the higher the marginal productivity of fertilizer use is, the more fertilizer they use, of course, and the risk here, the sigma square, reduces the input use as long as this term here is positive. That means that the application of fertilizer is indeed profitable. For a sharecropper, this looks similar, but we see here the risk effect is a bit weakened because the S here is the share of the harvest which goes to the farmer, which is between 0 and 1, and also the revenues here are a bit smaller. So if we look how does what determines fertilizer use in the end, we find that the higher the expected productivity is, which is linked to rainfall, distance to markets, for example, the more fertilizer they use. And for risk, we find an ambiguous result, which depends really on the sign of this expression here, whether fertilizer use is really profitable or not. We also looked whether sharecropping farmers apply more fertilizer than renting farmers, and we do not find a clear sign here. It also depends, or it again depends on the profitability of the fertilizer use and the cost of the fertilizer use. So there's an expression here giving the condition. We can summarize the results as follows. We have an effort effect that sharecropping reduces a bit the incentive to apply fertilizer, which corresponds to the Marshallian hypothesis, and we have an insurance effect because also the variance of the profits are reduced by sharecropping, which tends to increase fertilizer use. Finally, if farmers could really choose between being a sharecropper or a renter, how would they do so? We just compare the expected profits under both tenure regimes, and we find that if the mean productivity is very low, farmers tend to be sharecroppers, so this is the case for low rainfall areas. And regarding risk, we have not a clear finding. It depends whether productivity is very high, then risk really leads to a switch in the preference from being renter to sharecropper. So risk only is beneficial for sharecroppers if they live in an environment where productivity is very high. So let me come to the empirical results. The theoretical model just helps us to get an intuition and to develop the empirical model. So we used a household survey which was based on a World Bank project in Africa conducted by the Center for Environmental Economics and Policy for Africa and South Africa. This was conducted in 11 African countries. In the end, we selected only 9 countries because Egypt was in there, where we have only irrigation farms, so there is no weather risk. And we had to drop Kenya because there was no information on land tenure type available in the survey. The survey relates to the 2002-2003 agricultural year. And then we merged the household survey with the climate data on district level. And just to get an impression, what is the geographical coverage here? The light gray shaded areas are the countries which we considered, and the dark gray areas were the districts where we had households data and which we merged then to the climate data on district level. The climate data was from the CRU data source, which is a standard data source for time series climate data on half-degree resolution. For the climate data, we used precipitation and temperature, averages, and the variance over the last 10 years as an indicator for climate and weather-related risks. We have market distance here, we have land size, household size, farm value, and so forth. On the dependent variables, we were interested, of course, in whether a household is sharecropper, and whether he owns livestock, how many livestock he owns, and how much fertilizer he uses. Maybe I skip this because I'm running out of time, so let's look into the choice of being a sharecropper or not. In relation to our theoretical model, we saw that sharecroppers are more likely in an environment which is characterized by low rainfall and high variability if rainfall is high. And we find exactly the same in our empirical results. So the lower the rainfall is, the higher is the probability to be a sharecropper using a probit model. This is the full sample regression here with no household controls and with household controls. For the household controls, we could have an endogeneity problem. That's why we have shown here both columns. And this is a subsample of countries where sharecropping is in particular very common. So it's Ghana, Cameroon, and South Africa. And for the risk factor, we see indeed that risk is very important for those households who live in regions with very high rainfall. So let me come to fertilizer use and livestock ownership. So regarding fertilizer use, our results are very confusing. They are not in line with what we expected, because we find that high precipitation leads to lower fertilizer use, and high variance in the weather variable also leads to more fertilizer use. However, what we find is that sharecroppers tend to use more fertilizer because they probably can engage in higher risky farming activities. Regarding livestock ownership, the results are very in line with our expectations. Households in dry areas are more likely to be sharecroppers, and also households exposed to high precipitation risk are also more likely to be sharecroppers. Are more likely to own livestock. Sharecropping affects livestock negatively, which also indicates that there's an interaction between sharecropping as a risk management strategy and livestock ownership. So we combined these results between being a sharecropper as a long-term decision and using fertilizer or livestock use as a more short-term risk management decision in a bivariate probit model to find out to what extent these different risk management strategies are substitutes or complements. The regression models are basically the same, but we are now interested in the correlation of the error term between being a sharecropper and using fertilizer use, and this is positive, which means that those households conditional on all the covariates which are sharecroppers are more likely to apply fertilizer use. And for livestock, we have, as expected, a negative correlation, which indicates that households who are sharecroppers are less likely to be livestock owners, as they do not need to rely on this risk management strategy. So let me sum up. In our theoretical model, we got some understanding on the implication of climate risk on risk management and land tenure strategies, and this very simple model already revealed that there is not always a linear relationship, and that the preference for being sharecropper or the intensity choice for fertilizer depends on various conditions. We used a very comprehensive household data set, and we get for the first time a very comprehensive and robust picture how sharecropping affects fertilizer use in several African countries, and how sharecropping is related to climate factors. We find that sharecropping is more prevalent in dry areas and areas with high rainfall risk, which is consistent with the theory. Livestock ownership is more likely in areas with low and highly volatile rainfall, which also indicates the important insurance mechanism here. Fertilizer is really puzzling. We have no good explanation for this. Maybe fertilizer decision is completely driven by other rationales than risk management and profit maximization. Finally, we found that sharecroppers use more fertilizer and have less livestock, which is an important political implication because this type of risk management strategy can be very effective without reducing yields and agricultural or cereals production that much. What are ways for future research? I think one challenge is really to model climate-related risks, to explore the causal channels in more detail using panel data. We don't have panel data, unfortunately. What are other risk management strategies? We could think about social networks, savings, crop diversification, and so forth, where we have only limited data in our data set. And finally, a very interesting topic would be to disentangle the mechanisms of insecure tenure, land tenure, because sharecropping means that the farmer cannot cultivate this land for a very long time, probably, and the insurance provision in sharecropping, and what of the two effects then overweights. With this, I'm ending my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and look forward for comments.
Thank you, Matthias, for your presentation. This is an important topic to understand because of the implications of climate change and food security in contexts where formal kinds of insurance are unavailable or are weak. And then this research actually suggests that both farmers and landowners will play key roles in developing farm-based responses to weather for agricultural solutions to climate change. Land tenure relationships between landowners and farmers means that effective responses will occur when both work together to share costs and responsibilities, as well as receive benefits, even though each group could act alone. The empirical evidence on sharecropping and risk management is actually limited, and this paper sheds some light into the issue. And so I'd like to congratulate you and the co-authors for taking an attempt at this issue. I'd like to touch on two issues. The first is, while sharecropping can be used as a risk coping strategy, it's plausible that at the same time there will be an undersupply of labor by the tenant, leading to divergence of agricultural production from its efficient level. The question I have is, how should policy balance between promoting production efficiency and risk reduction in a sharecropping arrangement? How can the efficiency aspect be captured in the theoretical and empirical strategies of the paper? The second is, it's argued in the literature that with constant returns to scale, sharecropping has no added risk-sharing advantage over a suitable mix of fixed rent tenancy and wage labor contracts. And in your paper, there is quite a bit of variability in the land size. Have you considered differentiating the determinants of sharecropping for small landholders versus the medium and large-scale farmers? And do the returns to scale play any role in determining sharecropping? And so with that, I'd like to open the floor to the audience for comments, questions, any feedback that you may want to give to the co-authors. And we have a mic here. Don't be shy. Questions, comments? Yes, you can go ahead and answer.
So let me just try to answer your questions. Regarding smallholders versus large-scale farmers, we looked only into households which are basically smallholder farmers with land size lower than 5 hectares. And we looked a bit into this threshold because we think that very large-scale farmers probably have other means and better means to hedge against risks than smallholder farmers. They have access to insurance, they have access to financial products. I imagine that this is very common for large-scale South African farmers maybe. So we just looked into smallholder farmers and neglected the differentiated impact. But it's a good suggestion to look into this. Regarding the policy implication, I think, of course, it's good to provide additional risk management instruments to farmers, like weather insurance and access to savings and access to credit. I think sharecropping should not be a substitute to this and replace these efforts to enhance access to formal insurance possibilities. So, but I think one should be aware that sharecropping also can be can play a role in reducing risk for farmers, and that institutional factors could maybe considered, or institutional designs could be considered that enhance sharecropping also in other countries.
Any further comments? All right, I guess we can move on to the second paper. And it's a presentation by Emily Schmidt from the International Food Policy Research Institute. The title of the research is Ensuring Agricultural Productivity Over Time, Impact of Sustainable Land Management Program on Rural Farmers in Ethiopia. The co-author is Hanane Tedesse.
Good morning. I'm excited to be here. This is the first time that Fanai and I are presenting our work, so I'm very much looking forward to any comments, critical or complimentary. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the impact of the Sustainable Land Management Program in Ethiopia. This has been a large program, and I'll talk a little bit more to the details as I go through the presentation. But first, just to get some baseline, The Ethiopian agriculture remains very important in the Ethiopian economy. It comprised about 2/5 of GDP in 2013. It employed about 3/4 of the population, and roughly 86% of the population is still living in rural areas. So it's a very rural country, and very highly dependent on agriculture as a means of livelihoods. However, it's confronting a really large land degradation problem. This continues to be a major challenge to sustainable agricultural development opportunities within the country. And this is due to a variety of things. One, there's high population pressure in the rural highlands of Ethiopia, which is where the large share of agricultural production occurs. There's high dependence on rain-fed agriculture, but there's also a mixed crop and livestock livelihood practices. This means that when you're not growing any crops on your land, you have livestock that are basically foddering, eating any of the remaining residue off the land. Now then you have the rains that come, and you don't have any sort of vegetation that's still on the ground that would hold any of the soil in place. So you can see that this leads to a vicious circle of land degradation and erosion over time. So in order to address some of this, there's been a variety of sustainable land management programs that have been ongoing for several decades and have come in and have left. People have evaluated this, and they've found, to the most part, there's very little maintenance of these programs once they've come in. They've constructed whatever infrastructure they're going to put on the land. Usually within a couple of years, farmers are not so much willing to maintain this type of infrastructure. There have been papers that have talked about that as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So now there's a new program that's come in. It's called the Sustainable Land Management Program. And I'm going to give you a little preview of the results in case I'm not able to get to them in detail. Hopefully I will. But we look at the Sustainable Land Management Program using panel-level data, household-level data, to assess the impact on value of production of of this program. And what we find is, in effect, after 1 year of the program implementation, there's no significant effect on value of production. This isn't really all that surprising. This takes time to build back soil nutrients. It takes time to mitigate some of the erosion effects. What is interesting was after 4 years of program implementation, we find 18% increase in value of production. This was really surprising, also because some of my previous work really didn't find that type of an impact. So we start to wonder, is this a program that's really going to work, and how can we kind of think about sustaining it? So this provides new evidence. One, because we're able to look at a panel of a specific program. Previous types of work have looked at possibly a specific implementation structure. So how do terraces change agricultural productivity on this specific plot, and have been really specific to these areas? Or we just haven't had the panel level data to be able to look at these impacts. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, this was a day I was out walking around in one of the sites, and this is towards the end of the rainy season and the end of August. And this was a normal day at one of our bridges where I also did some hydrological work, where we were measuring water levels. And that night, there was about an average to maybe slightly larger than average rainfall episode. And the next morning, here's what my bridge looked like. So you can see that this wreaks havoc on any sort of landscape, because you have water that is not permeating into the soil at all. It's having a very quick runoff. And it starts to scar the landscape in all kinds of ways, even in flat areas. So you see large gullies are being formed, and you also have a lot of destruction of crops. So this is clearly a large issue, and you do see it going on pretty much all over the agricultural highlands. So what has the government and others tried to do? Well, they've definitely highlighted this as an issue. In the past 5-year plan, the PASDUP, a series of land and watershed management activities were implemented to augment kind of agricultural production and help to sort of slow down this process of erosion. This current 5-year plan outlines the need to promote investments that are specific to agroecological zones. So one of these programs are the Sustainable Land Management Program, and right now it's targeting 135 woredas in 6 regions. Woredas are like districts. And they're wanting to scale up and increase the adoption of these sustainable land management programs and interventions by farmers. So they're really trying to get at the household level of increasing this. And they're doing this through a variety of ways. They're constructing watershed and management areas to stabilize soils, improve water retention, but also building the capacity of some of the development agents that are in these areas, working to work with farmers to implement these types of infrastructures. So here's what they look like. So you have in the top left corner soil bonds. There's some of this gully rehabilitation where you see the check dams, stone terraces, and these are kind of the sort of infrastructure that they're putting in place out in these highland areas. So what do we do to try to evaluate the impact of some of this intervention that's occurring? We had a baseline survey that went out in 2010 before this sustainable land management program really took off. It was in 9 worredas, so this is not representative of the entire program within the Blue Nile Basin. And we stratified 3 kabeles per worreda, so kabeles are like sub-districts. And we looked at planned SLM programs and then kabeles that had no formal program prior to that. Round 2, we went back. We found 1,748 of those 1,810 households, so had quite a low attrition rate. 2 of the sample worredas in the end didn't end up getting a program, so they're excluded from this analysis. But we ended up with around 1,352 households that comprise the panel survey, panel analysis, which I'll be talking about today. Here are the sample sites, and it's important to notice that according to how the program was going into place, as I mentioned, they wanted to look at finding specific interventions for specific agroecological zones. So we tried to also stratify the sample by agroecological zone. And if you look, it's through these areas or throughout the highlands. This is more of a lowland area, so they're focusing on coffee production as well as other lowland crops, whereas as you come in here, this is very highland. So this area in Degadamot is more on barley. You also see potato cropping here. So we really have tried to seek out different areas within the Blue Nile Basin and within the highlands. And just to give you an idea of the differences across these worredas in terms of cropping patterns, you can see that one, which is really important in what we're assessing, are the amount of land, share of land that's being farmed on either a steep or a mixed slope. And this really varies. I mean, you have somewhere about 3/4 of the share of land that's being farmed on a steep slope to somewhere below approximately 1/4 of the land. So this really differs by worreda, as well as the types of shocks that farmers' households had reported experiencing. So we have areas that have experienced, half of our households have had to experience drought or floods, whereas others really have a lot less experience with that. Similarly, cropping patterns are quite different across worredas, and this leads to differences in values of production. So we have areas that have focused a lot on teff. Teff is a very high-value cereal crop, where we see higher levels of value of production. And then again, as I was mentioning, this area, which is quite high in altitude, focusing on barley and horse beans, has a lower value of production. But when we look across the entire sample, we see a couple of really, really positive developments. So we've seen a very large increase in value of production over time between the baseline and the inlined. There has been a lot more fertilizer application in use, as well as improved seed use. So in 2010, less than 1/4 of our households we're using fertilizer, and now we're up to half of our households. That's improved seed use. And again, fertilizer has gone up. Specific structures in both control and treatment, we're not there yet, but in all areas have gone up. And that's due to a lot of things, not only this SLM program, but also there's been a government effort to have a lot of people in all areas, even outside of this program, try to put on their own sustainable land management structures. So this leads me to why this is a bit of a challenge in order to evaluate these impacts. One, this program was not random at all in its program placement. We have big differences that are across worredas, as I've mentioned, And on top of that, this program was rolled out at different times within the Covariates. So in Amhara region, which is, let's see, I can show you. Yeah. This region here, we have Amhara, and then we have Oromia region that's down here in the dark red. In Amhara region, it was rolled out in 2009. These were primarily stakeholder meetings, sort of planning and initiation. And in Oromia, it was rolled out in 2012. So we have quite a few differences that we're going to need to take into account. So in order to do this, we combine propensity score matching as well as double difference methods. Households are categorized as treatment or control based on cabeles that received the program. So this would take into account any community effects, whether you are a household that put sustainable land management structures on your land or not. You may have benefited from being downhill from somewhere where a community program has gone on. So we take this into account in terms of looking at the cabele level. And we form 3 respective groups. So we have households that received no exposure to the program, those that have had 1 year at baseline but 4 years at the follow-up. So they've had a full follow-up 4-year. And then the third group is those that have had 0 at baseline and 1 year at the end line. Now group 2, since our baseline came 1 year after the program, there was a couple things we had to sort out. One was what was actually done in that first year before the baseline. The second one was at baseline we decided to actually ask a recall on production. So we asked what was the harvest in 2009 instead of asking the harvest in 2010. That way we were able to hopefully capture anything that would have occurred before this implementation period in 2009. Okay, so we want to distinguish the effects by rollout. So in this sense, we have, and rather than one treatment variable, we have 2 treatment variables for each respective group. Group 2, which is our group who has had the program for 4 years, and Group 3, which has had the program for 1 year at the end-line survey. We're going to focus on Beta 1 and Beta 2 for impact estimates. We also include the type of group you were in and your time period at inline in order to take into account any separate time, mean time effects or group effects. And then we have a selection of baseline covariates that we also include. We do 2 models here. One is just using the baseline, but the second baseline covariates, the second we also interact some of these select baseline covariates with our inline time period in order to take care of hopefully any heterogeneous secular effects. And that we can think of, for example, if we're looking at baseline characteristics and we look at number of development agents that are there, or land characteristics, or input use, you can think that maybe households would be more willing if they were in a program to actually take up some of this technology from baseline. So you may actually see 2 different trajectories between those control and those treatment groups. So what do we see? In Group 2, where we've had this program for about 4 years, we see really high effects. We see a 17%, 18% effect when we're not taking into account that interaction between some of these characteristics and our end timeline period. But we find very similar robust results when we come up with, when we start interacting that with our end time period. So this is quite surprising to see such an effect after 4 years. We're still working with trying to sort out exactly what that is, but we wanted to talk a little bit about what might be driving some of these increases in value of production. So what we do see between the 2 is that there's really no significant increase in cereal value of production in our control, whereas in our treated, there is. The other big difference, what seems to be happening in our treated, is that there's actually a shift. So on land that was previously planted with wheat, it's now being planted with teff. Teff, again, is a more high-value crop. Now, one question that came up is, why do we see these yields decreasing here? Well, again, this comes from possibly land that had been planted before with wheat, which is now turning over to teff, may not be perfect for teff. However, it is still a higher value crop, so farmers are in the end getting a higher value. It just hasn't arrived at the right land conditions perfect for what would be an ideal teff land area. Second is we see specific increases in certain crops. So we see a 46% increase in the yield of root crops. This represents the second largest share of cropped area in our treatment cavales, and that's primarily potatoes. Also, it seems as though investments may have prevented yield declines in pulses, whereas in the control we see a big drop in pulse yield in the control cavales. So, in conclusion, our panel survey data allows us to really have a better look over a variety of agroecological zones over time to see what type of benefits these SLM programs may be providing. And they seem to be providing greater benefits than previously thought, and within a shorter time frame. This is due most likely to changes in crop allocation as well as increases in yield. Previous research had talked about needing at least 7 years of this. However, previous research was not looking at a specific program. They were looking at a variety of programs that had occurred throughout time in Ethiopia. Going forward, I think it's important to understand the impact of individual components. So these SLM programs were made up of a whole portfolio of different investments. And this is an opportunity now to start to look and pick apart at what type of individual investments may have caused some of the larger impacts, as well as really start to combine this with the costs on specific individual households of implementing such investments. That's it.
Thank you, Emily, for the presentation. Matthias, you have 4 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Emily, for this very interesting talk. I think it takes up a very important topic, namely the conservation of the productive base of our agricultural economies and the soil, which is very important for maintaining long-term productivity and the foundation of our agricultural production and food security. The paper is very well written and explained. It uses a very solid and interesting panel data set and develops a very clear analysis. So I have some comments and suggestions which you might to consider to incorporate in the paper. First is I found it a bit puzzling to compare baseline and endline outcome within each group, the treatment and the control group, because usually you compare the treatment and the control group with each other. And my suggestion would be to calculate some growth rates or changes between baseline and endline within each group, and then compare the two groups and look whether they are statistically different or not, to really get the impact on the treated. Second, looking into the tables, the difference between treatment and control groups are very small from many variables. In particular, the sustainable land use management practices seem to be very similar. This was at least my impression. So you argued that the shift from wheat to teff could be one explanation for higher productivity base, and I think one needs to develop more indication to explain really the increase in productivity apart from this. Then the aim of the program was to reduce degradation, and you looked into, in your double difference regression model, into crop revenues, and I think this is a very important indicator, but one could also look in one step before already, what are the implications for the sustainable land use management practices, because if the government program was supposed to address this, evaluation should also look into the objectives of this government program and then really look into SLM practices or indicators. Finally, because it's a government program, establishing statistically significant impacts is important but not enough. It's very important to estimate the cost and benefits of these programs. I think you mentioned it already, to look into the cost of the individual households. One also needs to look into the cost of the government, and maybe you have data for this. This would be very interesting to see how costly was this program, what are the benefits of this in terms of increased production value and increased soil quality. And finally, the spillover versus individual effects, you mentioned it also already, I think is very important because you focus on the households, whether they are in a district or cabale which is treated and not whether the household is treated. And I think this is very important to distinguish between these two. I would imagine that the impacts are even stronger if you look on the individual household, because you have more detailed information and available to what extent the household benefited from these measures or not. Yeah. these were my major points.
Thank you, Matthias. Emily, do you want to tackle the response?
I think I'll
And then
take
go
most
ahead.
of those as comments. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just as suggestions. Which are
So we have 10 minutes for comments, questions from the audience.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I just had one question. Since the title of the paper mentions the word productivity, did you think about using like a simple measure, instead of looking at the value of production, perhaps looking at labor productivity, the value of production per the number of household members? So, because if I think, if we see an increase in production for households, if we can't really say much about productivity without knowing how many members of the household there are, without knowing how the output is being divided among household members. So I think that would be one suggestion that I have. Maybe aside from looking at production value, which is of course important, maybe also look at a measure of labor productivity itself. Another question, but I think you already answered it about the stratification, so that was it.
Hi, Emily. I just had a very quick question. I think as Matthias mentioned, your kind of headline result on the serial value, actually there didn't seem to be a great difference between the treatment group and the control group. It was the statistical significance. If I understood the slide correctly, that was different. So I was wondering if you could talk about the sample size. I mean, was the sample size very different between the control group and the treatment group? Do you think it's a power issue? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Any more questions? All right, Emily.
How do I turn this on, you know? Is it on? Can you hear me? Oh, it's already on. Okay, first, Matthias, thank you very much for your comments. This is really helpful. As I mentioned, this is the first time we're presenting this paper, so it's great to have as many comments as possible. In previous work, we've looked at the individual household effects of actually implementing something on your specific plot and trying to kind of untangle those. And indeed, we do see differences. However, it takes a little longer. And the reason for that is when you're starting to think in terms more of a watershed than of a household economic model. So in terms of a watershed economic model, call it watershed economic model, you have these overland water and under base flow water. And so if you impact something that's somehow up, and think of it as a valley, up in the higher levels of your watershed in those household areas, the lower households are inevitably going to be impacted, whether they did anything or not. And this is due to whether, and sometimes in a good way, and sometimes in a bad way. If you have no one in above you that's doing any sort of implementation, I remember talking to a farmer and asking him about this. He said, not a problem, because I'm getting all of their topsoil. On the other hand, you know, you're talking to another farmer who actually sits in a lower sort of basin area, and he says, yeah, I get flooded all of the time. So there's actually a real communal watershed type of effect. So in this, we're trying to capture that and understand. I've actually talked to one of the program implementers who looked into this, and he criticized that I wasn't taking into account other cabeles that were even lower down in the larger whole water basin area. However, I don't have household data on those people. I don't know anything about them. So it really depends on kind of what frame you want to look at. I think it's really worth, though, rerunning this again, just looking at the household and providing that at least as a specific kind of side analysis, looking at the specific household and see if we see any differences based on exactly this program. I think that's a great idea. Your other suggestions, absolutely, I will look into those and take them into account. So thanks again for your comments. Looking at, the first one was looking at why look at value production and maybe look more at labor productivity. This is a really interesting suggestion. We looked at this a little bit in a previous paper, but more looking at off-farm labor productivity. And this was really important because there is a significant cost in maintaining some of these sustainable land management interventions. One is just your opportunity cost of time. So most of these programs are going in during the off-farm season, which is when someone could, in theory, go and look for wage work or for other types of possible kind of immediate gain work rather than hold off and do your sustainable land management and hope that next year you're maybe going to have higher productivity on your land. It's a huge cost. Absolutely. We found previously that in effect it retards any sort of value on overall household income by about 12 years when you're looking at these opportunity costs, taking into account implementing these sustainable land management. We haven't looked at specific labor productivity on agricultural area. We just don't have the data on that, but that's a really interesting topic to kind of think about and look into.
You have, excuse me, sorry. So you do have information on the number of household members, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you have information on the number of household members that are working on the farm, for example. So I was thinking not even going to a difficult measure of not even total factor of productivity, nothing so complicated, but simple labor productivity, just the production value divided by the number of household members working.
Okay.
So let's say production per worker.
Uh-huh.
So something measure of labor productivity that's simpler, but because you're talking about labor productivity, you can just add one more regression table, which includes the production per unit rather than the aggregate production. I think it would be a very simple addition to the paper, actually.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks for the comment. Okay, and then finally looking at these, what's driving this in terms of the differences in cereal productivity. So there's a couple of the big macro statistics. So when we're looking at just increases in agricultural GDP, we see that cereal production accounts for about 70% of agricultural GDP, contributing to growth in agricultural GDP. So cereals is really the big story in Ethiopia still. We don't see a lot of conversion into vegetables or conversion into anything else. Teff is a definitely high value crop. So when we're looking, although these percentages are quite small, we're looking at a 5 and 7% decrease, right? A 7% decrease in the area of wheat versus a 5% increase in the area of teff that's being calculated into this value of production. I think you have a really good point in terms of the overall values being small, and I probably need to look into that a little more. But this seems to be kind of a repetitive story that we've seen quite a bit in looking at some of these greater investments on land. But I'll definitely look into that in more detail.
Thank you, Emily.
Just about everybody. Okay.
And now we'd like to move on to the next paper by Markus Goldstein from the World Bank. And the title of his paper is Empowering Women Through Land Title Registration, Evidence from the Rwanda National Title Registration.
Thanks. So this is co-authored work with a number of people. And what I'm going to talk about today is a little more than the gender impacts and broaden it a bit. So a bit of theory, why property rights matter. Most of you all know this theory, but there's one little piece that I want to focus on, which is Besley and Gottak in their paper talk about this idea of guarding labor. So one of the mechanisms through which better tenure security improves output would be through increased investment, but also through this idea that there's this segment of labor that you use to protect your land. So it contributes to output in that it reduces the probability that your land gets taken, but it doesn't produce anything in terms of an additional unit of agricultural yield. And that's the notion that I'm going to try and show you today. A quick review of the literature, just some very few examples. One paper that is germane here is some work that 3 of us did on a pilot for this program. And 2 results that I want you to keep in mind, because I'm going to show you opposite effects now in the national program. One is that one of the ways the program was constructed led to women who were not officially married losing rights in the pilot. Okay, this was for a very good reason. If I had more than 15 minutes, I'd explain it. But it turned out not to have a very good impact. So some segment of women were actually losing rights in the pilot program. Second was that we found fairly significant investment effects for both men and women. It was about double for female-headed households in the pilot program. Okay? Now, there's 3 other papers that I just want to quickly pull in here. One is a paper that we've done on Benin recently, which shows increased investment when property rights are improved, but you see a shift in female labor to fields that are less secure. So not every investment, property rights weren't uniformly improved, and so there's perhaps a guarding labor shift there. De Gendry et al. In a recent paper on Mexico, and Field in Peru, I think both of these papers give you a sense that part of what people are doing with their time is simply protecting their property rights. There's broader relevances for growth, because we can think about releasing this labor, which isn't producing sort of higher agricultural yields, and getting it more active in the economy. Okay, so let me quickly give you the results, and then I can sit down. No. We're going to show you that rights improve, which is a good thing, but then I'm going to show you that investments in agriculture go down and yields are fairly constant. I'm going to show you that people are actually going off farm to work, and in terms of self-employment, but also for a wage, and that their wage income is higher, not wages. And then I'm going to show you that a particular part of the farm labor goes down in generally, but it's mostly coming from a particular part of the farm labor, and we're going to argue that that's guarding labor. And that welfare, in the end of the day, without one measure that we do have, improves. Okay, quickly, Rwanda, the highest population density in Africa, really small parcels, really fragmented land. Okay. A lot of legislative changes leading up to this program. There was a change in inheritance legislation, but then a much broader and sweeping change in the laws that governed land and property rights. And this culminated in the 2005 Organic Land Law, which has nothing to do with organic farming, but has to do with rights. And so the program that we're looking at is the registration of the rights as laid down in the laws. It's a cheap program, costs about $9 to $11 per parcel in the rural areas, which is what we're looking at today. But everybody gets their land registered, and there's a nominal fee to pay to get that final title. But the demarcation and the whole recordation of rights is going to happen to everybody. That's not voluntary. So this is an experiment. We worked with the government to randomize the rollout of this program at the national level in 25 of the 30 districts. 5 were excluded for political reasons. So think of it as pretty representative of Rwanda. And within each district, or within this set of districts, we randomly selected 50 sectors to be treated first and 50 to be last. There are some randomization issues. Not now. They're not major. Okay, data. So I think the thing to take away from the first 2 bullets is that we're basically observing people on average a year later. So these are very early impacts of the program. The program implemented a lot faster than we expected, so that's what we got. The survey covered a whole range of things: intra-household allocation, but also investment in land, agricultural production. What it didn't do a good job of, and you'll see this, is looking at off-farm income. So we have some things there, but of course now we wish we had more. All right, so we're going to estimate impacts within ANCOVA. It's pretty straightforward, and we're stratifying at the district level. Okay, so here's the first set of results, which is the improvement in security. And so basically, if you look across this, people generally feel like they're less likely to have a disagreement, and they're more secure that they can leave their land to fallow, and then they won't lose it when they fallow it. Expropriation, we don't see any impacts, okay? So expropriation in Rwanda is a state thing. The government often, well, not often, but the way it works is the government takes land for eminent domain for consolidation for commercial purposes or so on. So, you know, in a way, I'm comforted by these results because the things that don't come from the government, such as disagreement, and people taking your land if you leave it fallow, are improving, but the government who's giving you the certificate, there's no change in the security. Okay, so now we're just going to take a look at both male and female changes in rights over the land as they reported them. So for men, we're seeing in some specifications maybe a decrease in the registered owner. Part of the hallmark of the laws is that your spouse became a joint owner with you. So that we may be picking something up there. But bequeath rights, rights to sell, right to mortgage, right to lease, we're seeing improvements in these. So for female rights, I think the important result from the pilot was that this interaction, this legal marriage interaction that you can see over there on the left, was negative. Legal marriage was, the main effect was negative before. It was a different specification before. So before we were seeing a decrease if you didn't have the legal marriage certificate. And now they're essentially showing the same impacts, with or without the marriage certificate. The government, it turns out, changed how they implemented the program, and so now the women who are in non-registered unions, which is about 30% of the couples, are getting equal rights and not losing them as part of this process. We don't see a change in the bequeath rights or rights to sell here. For women, we are seeing something, not super strong, on the right to mortgage. Okay, so land markets, just quickly, we're seeing a little bit of action on renting in and renting out. There is some heterogeneity here by female headship, which is important. That was also true in the pilot. Okay, in terms of investment, we're seeing a significant decline as a result of the program, and we're seeing no significant change in yields, although the number is negative. It's not significant. What we're seeing instead, or perhaps as the alternate route, is a big increase in self-employment and wage labor. So different ways of looking at it here. Households are more likely to be engaged in self-employment. They're more likely to have members of the household working in this sector, both for self-employment and for wages, and more of the people's time is going into that. And relative to the control mean, on the bottom, these are fairly large effects. For, as I said earlier, we don't unfortunately have self-employment earnings, but we do have wage earnings, and these are showing a significant increase. We tried so this is a work in progress. One of the things we were trying to see is where it might come from. It seems to be coming from a range of different types of employment, and no one particular area. So farm labor, as I said earlier, is going down. And so here we can see a decrease in the number of days that people are spending on their farm. which sort of spans all different types of the labor, with the exception of child labor, that they use. And so we have data on 3 different periods of the agricultural season. We have planting, we have maintenance, and then we have harvest. And what's interesting is that the biggest effects are in the planting period, okay? And so the planting period is where the guarding labor would be most important, because when I come to plant, and you're not there, if I'm not a nice neighbor, I may just plant a little farther than I should, right? And so these small encroachments are I think, where a lot of the tenure security is. It's a much bigger deal for me to come and take my neighbor's entire field. But if I take 10 feet, we can have a disagreement over where the boundary is. But if I was there first, that perhaps strengthens my claim, and I've already planted crops there. And so the decline in planting labor is where most of that decline is coming from, and we think that that has to do with this guarding labor. Field management is showing a couple of declines in labor, but nothing as big as we're seeing in the planting season, the planting part of the season. And then in harvest, we're actually seeing no significant declines except for whether or not they're using hired labor. So that's where most of the most of the decline is really coming from that planting period. So finally, we don't have aggregate income, but we do have one measure of welfare, which is the number of meals that were skipped by different people in the household. And what we're seeing is that for the folks who got more secure land tenure, we're seeing significant declines across the board, and fairly balanced across different members of the household, that everyone is sort of declining at an equal rate. Okay, so maybe I went a little too fast, but let me wrap up. I think there's a number of things to take away from this paper. First is the difference that you see between a pilot program and a program at national scale. And I think those are interesting, and I'm happy to talk about some ideas on that if you want. I think in terms of land tenure security, the lessons here are that we can have a low-cost registration process that can make a big difference for household production decisions. Of course, we have to maintain it, right? So it may be low cost to do the initial titling, but we do have to maintain it afterwards, and that's critical to sustaining these things. And I think in the case of Rwanda, what we're seeing relative to some of the other areas where I've worked on this, we're seeing this really interesting movement to off-farm work. Part of that is because it's a very population-dense country, but also because this is a national program, and so maybe we're starting to see some shifts in the economy as this labor that is no longer needed can go out and be productive elsewhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Markus. Emily, you have 4 minutes for discussion.
Thanks, this was really interesting, and for that reason I have a lot of questions. But I realized that the form of your paper was in a research note, so it's supposed to be succinct and informative, and it's very successful at doing that, really interesting. There's a few details that, if space permitting, would be really helpful for someone, a bit of the lay person on land tenure. One is just to explain a little bit the certification process in a little more detail. So it talks about this adjudication and demarcation, but how is it actually performed? Are neighbors involved? Is there measuring? Are GPS units involved? And then are husbands and wives both present at this time? The note was really interesting in talking about stakeholder meetings and who is coming and how, and it's really nice because it's quite gender disaggregated and talking about how many of the women came and how many of the men came. But it would be really interesting to know kind of that whole review process and putting these certifications together. What happens once they have measured? Does the household get to review what the final result is before that titling actually becomes formal? So those were a lot of questions that went through in my mind. Also, what's included in the land title? So in this document that I assume households are paying for, is there a map of the parcel, and then are both male and female names on the certificate, and is this a difference from what there was before, or are there pictures, or sort of what are the main identifying features of these documents would be really helpful. You answered my question in the presentation. I was just wondering how you elicited unbiased responses from women, but you interviewed them separately within the household, so that was really helpful to know. You talked about the costing being relatively inexpensive, parcels being very fragmented. So if a little more clarification on that, if the cost of a parcel is $9 to $11 for getting a certificate, what's the average number of parcels that households have? Are they paying 9 times they have 10 parcels, so we're looking at $90, and how cost prohibitive is this for poorer households? In the next round, maybe this is too early right now, but I think it could be interesting to disaggregate this analysis by the age of the household head. I'm just wondering if you looked between young versus mature household heads, matures, do those relationships still hold, or is there possibly some effect we're not capturing of someone who had experienced this genocide and sort of maybe distrust of any sort of government security processes that could have happened, they experiencing those as adult versus someone who had either, one, not been born or experienced those as a child, and what sort of perception does that have really on any type of ownership in any sphere within the country? So those were really my main questions that came out of it, but really interesting work.
Thank you, Emily. Now we have about 15 minutes. We have more time for questions and comments.
Hello. Yes. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I had some questions on the long-term consequences of these findings, because you say the investments in time and effort decrease on the plots, but the yields do not decrease. But could it be that on long term these yields might decrease because of conservation efforts being reduced? Because I read a paper of your colleague Deininger who showed that tenure security decreased the amount of trees planted on plots in Uganda. So couldn't be a similar process be going on in Rwanda? Thank you.
So my question is with respect, I think in one of your slides you showed that the labor on farming by male member and by female member, and it seemed like it was higher for female members, so their time spent on sort of, I think, I don't remember which one, but their time spent on farming went down more for female members than male members. And I was wondering if that was significantly different or if the coefficient was pretty similar. But then also then on the labor side, are there differences between who's going into self-employment or wage labor by female and males?
Thank you. I had a quick one. This is something probably you'll be working on in the future. Recently I've been hearing a lot of labor migration from usually Burundi and Rwanda into Tanzania and Uganda. I was just wondering whether it's probably part of the outcome of this process of land registration. If you are working on that or you are planning to work on that, I'll be happy to hear about it.
Are there more questions in the back?
Oh. Well, I'm going to take advantage of the mic moving. You mentioned, and it makes sense, that people might have the opportunity to fallow if they don't have to worry about somebody taking their land because it's been registered, but I may have missed it. I didn't see an impact on the registration on the incidence of fallowing, and I was wondering whether the decrease in labor might be because people are letting certain plots fallow.
Markus, you went through those slides pretty quickly, but it looked like to me that the control group mean on security was really high already. So you actually didn't have much effect, right? Maybe you might speak to that a little bit.
Markus, another question following Louise's point, but with the opposite interpretation. Something like a very small 4% reported having conflicts of some sort over their property rights in the control group. You cut it by half, I think. You knocked it down 2 of the 4 percentage points. You sort of provided an anecdote. I think this is, marginal encroachment, 10 feet. It's that kind of thing that's getting prevented. But I really sort of wondered how having a certificate helps me prevent the marginal encroachment, or was part of this image-based registration process that, posts are put in the ground. I was curious about sort of some of the underlying detail, and as this is early days in the analysis, maybe I'd be curious to see more as it unfolds.
Okay, can I actually answer some of it, because the list is, I can't keep up, and I want to do some of them justice. So, I can do the last and the first together. So, Emily, you're right that I had like 9 slides on the certification process with pictures, but I should have kept them. There's 9 steps, but basically I think the way it works is they do sensitization, and then they come to do the registration. I'm going to merge some of the steps. And when they do the registration, what they have are aerial photographs, and this is going to answer Owen's question. And when you demarcate a plot, this is why it's so cheap to do, is they go and walk the boundaries with the owner and their family, and there's varying degrees of who's present, but a lot of times it's both of them, the husband and the wife, and the neighbors, right? And so there's common knowledge afterwards. And you see it, like they're watching where you're walking. And then they draw it, and everyone can see it. And they're pretty big maps, pretty big photographs. So everyone afterwards understands it. And then it goes it's entered, digitized, things are posted in the village, close to the village level, and people they have a dispute period, and then there's an adjudication period, and so on and so forth. So it is when it's implemented right, it's a very transparent, and the neighbors all see, and there's sort of a lot of the disagreements, I think, got hammered out on those walks. So I think that's what happens. Coming back to some of your questions, Emily, what's in the title? They don't get a map. I think. I think that they could get one, but it's not included in the title. But both spouses are listed, and that's the big change. I think the effects were bigger in the pilot on this in terms of women's rights, because it was closer to when the law was passed. I mean, theoretically, it shouldn't matter if there's total rational expectations and everyone believes the government. But we don't live in worlds like that. So it does matter less now than it did before, which I think is somewhat interesting. The cost, sorry, this wasn't clear. The cost to do it is $9 to $11. The cost for the household is around $1. So yeah, it's my left out bit. They're only paying about $1 to get the title. Still, not all of them do. So it's clear that some of them aren't sure that it's worth it. And given that the rights are recorded, that's an interesting question, right? So your rights have been registered. If you're not going to transact, maybe you don't, you just let the government keep it and you can get it whenever you want. So it's not that your rights are incomplete, it's just that you don't have the certificate. I like the idea of disaggregating on the age of the household head. We also have some displacement questions and so on, so we can try and look at that. We have some local institutional questions too, so I think this idea. Okay, this question on long-term consequences, I think that also ties into the following question. So yeah, 1 year, it's a very good question. So we just have data coming in, which is 2 years later. The control group's been treated, but we should be able to get some sense of the answer to that question, and also to see if we can pick up some more following on the other side. So maybe they changed their investment composition too, away from sort of these are more structures that may have been marginal given the higher levels already. And so maybe they're following. So I think it's a really interesting empirical question. If only the government would have implemented slower, we would have a better answer for you now. It's the only time I've ever said that. Louise, your question on the property rights being marginal, yeah, those are, but Owen's also right. They're significant, but small. There was fairly high baseline levels of security for this, but we're seeing pretty big changes in behavior. I think those earnings effects are pretty big. Labor supply effects are pretty big. I think we need the property rights to establish the causal chain, but I don't think it's central at that point in time in Rwanda. It wasn't central to it's not the central effect that we're talking about. We're talking about what happens with the recognition of those rights in a different way. Good suggestions on migration, the difference. The migration question, we don't think they're leaving the household. Sorry, we don't think they're leaving the community much. So not even much migration within Rwanda. Again, it's 1 year. The interesting thing is that Mexico paper from de Jambry and co-authors, that's a longer time horizon, and there you really see the migration within Mexico. And so I think, again, that may be a longer term thing, particularly since there may be better wage and self-employment opportunities in Tanzania or in Kigali. Okay.
We have 5 minutes for more comments, feedback. Yep.
So 3 things, 2 on long-term investment. The one was briefly just to understand how you specified the variable structure of investment in the plot. And then the second was a kind of bigger question. You've sort of theoretically posed this in terms of guard labor on plots. Of course, the other school of thought is that people have more security, so they're more likely to invest in things that have to stay on their plots. So that could be in assets like fruit trees. It could also be in spending time on stuff like terracing or whatever Jeremy and Laurie's thing is about planting in little humps instead of on terraces in Rwanda. But that sort of work. And you don't seem to be seeing any of that, and I wondered if you had any sense of why that was, because that's our other big argument for tenure security. And then the third thing was, in relation to the guard labor hypothesis, you should potentially see more efficient use of labor. So you as the head of the household don't think you have to keep working on the plot. Instead, you hire in and you go do something more high value. And I wondered if you saw, you may have presented them, any effects on hiring in.
Question in the front row.
Thanks. Following on that question, I wonder if you have data that could help you disaggregate a little bit on those investments on the plots. We're just finding initial evidence now. Again, when you see better land tenure, they're actually decreasing those investments. We think of investments like planting trees, et cetera, and we think, okay, they're intercropping or something. But actually those planting trees, what they were doing previous when they didn't have land tenure, was creating a border. So they were using these investments really as demarcation lines, not so much as increasing agricultural productivity by intercropping or doing this. So I'm wondering if there's a way you can provide that disaggregated analysis by any chance.
Time for one more question, and then we can move to Markus's response. Yep.
Right. My question relates to the non-farm investments. I could imagine that with the access to land rights and the access to credits to finance a small business or...
Okay. Thank you. They are good. And some of them we're still working on. So the question of what is investment, which I think ties together, Emily, your point, and Kate's question as well. So one chunk of investment is Emily, you showed you a picture of buns. So buns and different things that Emily was showing you. So a lot of it's soil and water conservation, which are very important in Rwanda because it's so densely populated. And then the other chunk is structures. So buildings on the field and so on. It's not, we see nothing on trees. We looked at trees. There's nothing. In Benin, we found some impacts on trees, crop trees, cash crop trees, so it was nice. But not in Rwanda. We're not seeing it. It's 1 year. Maybe these fields are too small. There's a range of possible reasons why it could go on. So that's the investment story. On guard labor, all types of labor are going down. We're trying to push and see if we can understand some relative notions of labor efficiency, but it's a cut across the board. Labor markets for these villages are complicated. So it's not, you could come up with a theoretical explanation where that would make sense, but yeah, we still need to work on that some more. We don't see any effect on credit use. The credit market is far from complete. And the government policy, mortgages on one point was strongly discouraging them. So I'm not surprised. It'd be nice. That's a logical chain. But we're gonna try and tease that out a bit. The thing is, we don't have good enterprise data, just because that wasn't our focus. We spent a lot on the agricultural data, but not so much on the enterprise. So yeah, I share your frustration. Thanks.
Thank you, Markus. And now I'd like to call upon myself to present a co-authored paper. The title is Gender, Rural Land Certification and Tenure Security, Citing Evidence from Ethiopia. Tenure security is an important determinant of land-related economic outcomes. As we know, it has an impact on the way that land is being used, the potential to undertake future investment by farmers, and also transactions in land markets in terms of buying, selling, and renting out land. But more importantly, secure land rights is important for the women in poor rural communities because these are vulnerable groups and they're often discriminated in terms of access to productive resources that are needed to farm. However, the evidence on gender differentials in impacts of land reform programs are scant. So when we look at the existing literature on land reform and tenure security, and mind you here, the land reform is actually issuance of land use rights and not ownership rights, because the context here is Ethiopia, where land is state-owned. And when we look at this literature, the overall literature says that there is a positive association between issuing land use certificates and tenure security. So for example, in the case of Vietnam, Du and co-authors found in their 2008 paper that there is a positive impact on land-related investments through enhancements of tenure security. And Denninger, in the case of the Amhara region in Ethiopia, found the same result, positive impact on tenure security, and we continue also to find the same impact in the context of Madagascar. And so this paper explores, the objective of this paper is to explore the effect of rural land reform in Ethiopia's Amhara region on tenure security of female landholders compared to their male counterparts. And the objective of this paper was motivated by the 2002 Ethiopia Land Use Certification Program, because one of the objectives of this program was to strengthen the landholding rights of the female landholders. And identifying the gendered impacts on land reform and tenure security is crucial for devising effective agriculture and land policies that promote improvements in rural livelihoods of marginalized groups. And the evidence can shed light on the importance of land use certificates in the determinations of tenure security versus other factors that could have an impact on tenure security as well. And so the question is, to what extent are the issuance of land user rights necessary as well as sufficient in achieving tenure security of the female landholders compared to the male counterparts. The paper contributes to the existing literature in three ways. First, it fills a gap in the existing literature by incorporating the gender element in the economic analysis. Second is it tries to account for the socioeconomic and cultural factors that may play a key role in strengthening landholder rights of female landholders in the Amhara region. Third is it also tries to uncover differences in the mechanisms or channels by which land user rights could impact the tenure security of the female landholders versus the male landholders. And in order to meet the objectives of this paper, we exploit a panel survey from Studies for Sustainable Land Use in the Ethiopian highlands, and it furnishes data from 8 administrative districts in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, the Amhara region, and the survey captures household, parcel characteristics, and information and certification from 1999, 2002, 2004, and 2007. The program was introduced in 2002, so the years before that you look at the impacts. So in 99 is your baseline. We have 1,864 households, and we find in our survey that 17% of all the unique households are headed by female landholders. But before we move into the formal empirical analysis, let's have a look at the gender context in the rural Amhara region. Security of tenure is highly influenced by access to male labor as well as assets such as oxen. In the Amhara region, the female-headed households tend to be poorer relative to their male counterparts in terms of access to productive resources such as male labor, but as well as oxen as well, which are critical resources needed for farming there. But also, the protection of women's land rights in the Amhara region is to a great degree correlated with the level of family support that she can mobilize. Culturally speaking, if a woman has male and able family members, it is considered an embarrassment for them if they do not protect her land rights. And so the presence of male members in the household is quite critical for the tenure security of the female landholders. Social capital, which is cited in various literatures, is also expected to determine women's land rights in the Amhara region. And using the information from the survey, social capital here is defined as the informal mechanisms or means by which people can actually achieve secured land rights. And in the survey, there's a question that asks the households, have you participated in community organizations? And if they have answered yes, then we capture that as being households having some form of social capital. But also, it's important to get a perspective of the cultural aspect of the Amhara region. It's patriarchal in nature, and cultural norms and traditions actually define or restrict women in participating in certain modes of production, such as plowing. Culturally, they're not allowed to plow their land. And so the determination of the degree to which certification programs affect tenure security needs to be assessed in light of the complex interaction between key economic and societal factors and the land certificates provided to women. In light of the time restriction that we have, I would like to go over just one summary statistic, and that's table 2, which looks at the distribution of household certification status disaggregated by the sex of the household. The first observation is that we see an even distribution between male and female-headed households who say that they are tenure secure regardless of the certification status. And second observation that we see, which seems to be somewhat counterintuitive, is that there seems to be more observations in male and female-headed households who say that they are tenure secure but without certificates, relative to those who have certificates. The empirical evidence, we try to follow the strategy that was used by Denninger and Denninger and co-authors in their 2011 paper. They face the same data restrictions, use the same survey that we do, and the baseline model here is the Chamberlain random effects probit, which allows for arbitrary correlation between the the household-specific unobserved effects and the X variables. So Y sub IT is a dummy variable representing the household's perceived tenure security. If we consider households being tenure secure if they say that they don't expect any change in the size of their land holdings, or if they say that they expect an increase in the size of their land holdings. And we take them as being tenure insecure if they say that they are uncertain about the expected changes in the size of their land holdings, and also if they say that they expect a decrease in the size of their land holdings. And we run this tenures, we determine the perceived tenure security of the households on a set of variables. W sub IT is the treatment variable, the land holding certificate, 0 if they don't have a certificate, 1 if they do. And X sub IT is the vector of controls for household characteristics, parcel characteristics, and mode of production and social capital. The baseline regression results for the pool samples basically shows that certification increases the likelihood that households' perceived tenure security increases. And if we actually look at these results, and disaggregated by the male and female-headed samples, we see that the result of the pool sample is actually driven by the male-headed household sample. And actually we were surprised and sometimes not surprised to see that certificates seem to have an insignificant impact on the perceived tenure security of the female-headed households. But what we also see here as being significant is that wealth, which is proxied by the number of bulls and oxen that are owned by the household, if you are wealthier, you feel insecure. We did some robustness tests, which is very much an ongoing work. We did a household fixed effects linear probability model estimations, and also an IV linear probability estimation. And in both robustness tests, we continue to see the same result in that certification in the pooled sample has a positive impact on perceived tenure security, continues to have an insignificant impact on the perceived tenure insecurity of the female-headed households. And for the IV that we used to determine the certification status of the household is the distance of the household to the nearest road. Summary of key findings: issuance of land use certificates in the Amhara region increased the likelihood of perceived tenure security in both male and female-headed households, which is a result that is consistent with the existing literature. But the impact seems to be not gender neutral. It's in that it is significant and relatively greater in magnitude for the male-headed households. Policy implications: land certification programs alone may not be sufficient to eliminate gender differentials in tenure security without addressing other key determinants of tenure security. And advancing women's economic and social standing through rural land reform requires interventions that address group-specific challenges and that may interact with the impact of certification status of the households. And I leave it at that. Yep, Markus?
Okay, so just a couple comments. This is an important question. I think just to add to the motivation we saw in the presentation, as registration happens, any kind of rights registration, be it a certificate or a title, women could lose rights. The husbands could grab it, the process could ignore or actively discriminate against female rights, giving the land to men in the community. It's something we hear a lot about, but we don't have a lot of evidence. But the flip side is that it could be a good thing, not to be totally pessimistic about the world. Women generally have weaker land rights than men. Again, some evidence to this, but there probably should be more. And so a process that was even effectively gender neutral could benefit women more, right? So it's an important question because I don't know how it's going to end up. Okay, so that's the motivation. I have three sets of comments on the data, the estimation, and the conclusions. So first, the data. I read the longer paper, so I know maybe more than what was in the presentation. But it would be nice to understand what the sample is and where the data is coming from, what it might be representative of. And then there were some changes in the number of households over time, and it really, including the relative fraction of male and female-headed households, which seems important for this, and that wasn't clear to me why that was happening. So just more description, if you can get it from the people who collected it, on sort of what is this data and how should we think about it. Now, the dependent variable, I think there's a lot of richness there that could be used. So the question is, do you expect about changes in the size of your land holdings over the next 5 years? And in the paper, the authors are saying increase or no change is the same as secure, and decrease or don't know is the same as insecure. So I think there's more variables behind it that could give us a lot of interesting things to think about. First is, to me, don't know versus decrease is a very different kind of insecurity. If I expect my land to decrease, I know something. And there's some sort of expectations at play and so on. If, Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, maybe that's more in the don't know world. And so I think there's maybe something you could do with that. And then I think that you also have in the data some of the reasons that they expect this change. And some of those might not have anything to do with insecurity. And so to think about the varying degrees to which they relate. So there's government expropriation, there's buying and mortgaging are some of the reasons. And so some of those aren't, to me, really insecurity, but there are others which might hew closer to that. So trying to unpack that variable. One question I had was that the don't know goes from 0 in the first 3 rounds to 30 to 40% in 2007 when you start to have the certificates. So I was wondering why that was happening. I'm worried that it was 0, that was a flat 0 for 3 rounds of the data. But the increase is also super interesting, maybe. Okay, so I think here there's an endogeneity problem as the authors recognize in the estimation. So more understanding of how the registration process proceeded across communities, within communities, I think, or more explanation, not understanding, but just sort of for the reader to understand how that happened and why we should maybe not be worried about that. And so one option, so here in the paper they try and get around the endogeneity problem with the distance to roads. I'm currently wrestling with a paper where the endogeneity of location is very obvious. So I'm feeling location, whether it's given or chosen by people, is often very endogenous to a whole range of things. How about thinking maybe about a difference in difference with some pre-trend analysis, because you have 4 rounds of data. So if possible, can you do some pre-trend to convince us that a diff and diff would give us something useful? And that might be a nice thing to add to this. Okay, on the conclusion, I sort of prima facie, I agree with the statement that land certification alone is not going to solve gender issues. But here, I'm a little worried about the power. And so the coefficients between male and female-headed households aren't super different. And the standard errors on the female-headed households, which are in parentheses, are really big. And to me, they don't look statistically different from each other. So I would try some interactions. I'd also try some reverse power calculations, since you have all the pieces you need, to see what kind of gender effect you'd be powered for, so you can bound it. And try and work it out that way to see with what confidence you can say there is or isn't a gender difference. Thanks.
Thank you, Markus. I think we sort of expected these issues as well, because we're still trying to resolve them. The sample size is very small. It's 18% of 1,864, so it's quite small, and we acknowledge that. Yes, when we look at the tenure security variable, right, the increase, decrease, don't know, and no change, Denninger and co-authors looked at the impact of increase and decrease separately. But we can't do that in this paper because the sample size is already quite small. A further disaggregation is going to really make it hard for the empirical analysis to, for us to be able to say anything at all. But at least perhaps I take your point, maybe in the descriptive section we could just beef it up and talk a little bit more about it. But it's really hard to actually disaggregate the sample any further because we're already dealing with a very small sample size. As for what are the sources of expectations and the changes in the size of land holdings, majority of the respondents attribute those expectations to village redistributions and very little to other sources. So it's basically the state coming in and expecting that perhaps in the future they will take some land from the farmers in order to deal with the population pressures in the region. So it's really village redistributions that people tend to be afraid about. And also mind you that the last redistribution happened in 2004, which is just about 2 years after the certification program happened. And so when a lot of the respondents who said who are tenure the fraction of households who said they are tenure secure in 2004 has increased significantly in 2007 because they called the last redistribution, which was in 2004. Endogeneity problem, classic problem in this case. I agree we need to talk maybe a bit more about the certification process. I think perhaps we did that in the paper, but definitely that could be tied up into the section. And we'll look into the difference approach as well. We tried a couple of interactions as well to see the gender effects, and we did not see any difference from this result, and so we just decided to report these results in the paper, but perhaps they could be added in the appendix. Yep.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It's just a clarification question. I was wondering, female-headed household, is that when a woman is not married, or do you also have female-headed households in married households? And then it probably evolves over time because a female-headed household can become not female-headed anymore a few years later. How did you take that into account?
Yep.
Thank you for a very interesting work and presentation. I just want to add a little more point on the suggestion of maybe potentially using even this approach. If I remember correctly, the land certification program rolled out sequentially across different, correlation variables. So I'm wondering whether you could use the variation in the timing of the land certification program
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer those two questions. So the female-headed households in this sample are actually the widowed. perhaps when we actually look at their status also over time, they have both their name and the husband's name in the certificate, and if the husband passes away, then they become the heads of households, and so most of the ones, actually all of them, are actually the widowed. Thank you for the suggestion for a diff and diff. We could definitely do that, and that will be the next step for the analysis, yeah. We actually have more time for questions, comments, feedbacks, not just on this presentation, but also on the overall if you have any more. All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up then. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the presenters for sharing their paper with us. Thanks to the discussants for sharing your thoughtful comments. But also thank you to the audience for sharing with us your feedback as well. I think we've learned quite a bit this session about land tenure, gender issues, sustainable land management, agriculture risk management. Thank you for coming, and continue to enjoy the rest of the conference.